So today I have with me JP Marceau. I'm Yosef, for those of you who don't know me. And JP recently wrote an article on the symbolic world about, it was called Rome Grafted, Israel Regrafted, I believe.
Yeah. Rome cut off, Israel regrafted.
Okay,
Yeah,
Rome cut up, Israel
close enough.
Regrafted. That was fascinating, and it deals a lot with, I guess, the fertility crisis and demographics, but at the same time, symbolically, through stories like Cain and Abel and Joseph in Egypt and some of the others in Egypt, and then was fairly focused, though not entirely, on how Israel or Jews, or at least some subset of Jews, Orthodox Jews maybe, are doing, why they're doing well, how they're doing well in this world that seems to be very difficult, and for many, many reasons. And there was also a very strong urbanism theme and the kind of the challenge of the city in the modern era. So, okay, JP, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more? Is there anything I missed? Other stuff about your background that might be relevant?
Yeah. I can say I write on the Symbolic World blog from time to time. My main background, I would say, is in metaphysics. So I wrote a book on Christian metaphysics. I spent a lot of time in this little corner of the internet for the past, I don't know, between like 2016 and 2022 maybe. I was most active in dialogues between John Rubicki and Jonathan. And I ended up writing a book, tried to make the best bridge I could between naturalism and Christianity. That's really like my core background. And then for the past 2-3 years, I've been sort of branching out into other topics, and some of which are very close to me. And there's like one big practical thing that I find interesting both for myself and for my community and even at large is the problems of technology and faith and family even you could bring into the mix. So that's what the core of the article was about, really. I tried to trace the pattern of technology and cities since Cain in that article, and I show that the way that a good way in which we can sort of track the effects of the negative effects of technology, especially today, is in the fertility crisis. And the basic mechanism is fairly obvious. Like if people lose faith, then this tends to erode community bonds, and then it's harder for people to meet. It's harder for young men and women to meet early enough to marry and have kids. It's harder for them to stay together. It's harder for them to take care of lots of kids. So you see very dramatic drop in fertility. And there are other metrics you could look at, but fertility is really the best we have because all countries care about it, because it's like what makes or break a country largely. And so far, all communities that we have data on for like any reasonably long length of time hasn't managed to like become technologically prosperous and keep a high fertility rate, except for Orthodox Jews. So that's like the glaring exception. So I wanted to look at it, and like it's true for like I think there are subgroups of Christians who might be doing it, but we don't have like data for a long enough time to know that they're actually doing it and remaining like coherent across time. Like lots of let's say conservative Christian communities that I think can make it through. It's not clear how many members they are bleeding, let's say, through the generations. We know, however, that Orthodox Jews have been doing it for a while. And as far as nations go, like all nations so far, when they become rich, they face the problems of technology that I mentioned earlier. They lose faith in God, they lose community, and they have the fertility crisis. Except for Israel. Israel is the only rich nation that has avoided this so far, in part because they have lots of Orthodox Jews, obviously. But that's the pattern I investigated in the article. And I was very, very happy to see that you answered. You had some feedback on it because I haven't talked with a lot of Jews. Even like in Quebec City, like there's very few Jews here. When I lived in Montreal, I would have had better chances of actually like meeting like real life Orthodox Jews, but I don't have a lot of interactions these days. So I think you'll be a good person to speak to. So I was very happy to accept your invitation.
Excellent. For point of clarification, what what sort of Christian are you now?
Oh yeah,
Are you Orthodox? Are you
Catholic.
Catholic? Are you Catholic?
Catholic.
Okay.
Yeah.
In your Christian metaphysics books, which is naturalism focused, it's through Catholic natural law framing, or like where are you going? No,
I don't mention natural law at all. You can't really tell that the book is Catholic. It's a like I don't need to go into lots of let's say modern enough theology that people could really tell the difference. Like someone who knows a lot of authors will recognize that I quote a lot of modern Catholic thinkers, but mainly because they helped me understand Dionysius the Areopagite. That's like the main person who fixes lots of issues for me. And I also quote C.S. Lewis a lot, who's an Anglican. Like the book is really broken down into two parts. The first part is just an argument for non-reductive versions of naturalism and how non-reductive versions of naturalism are classical metaphysics. So there are of course distinctions you can make between like Plato and Aristotle and Plotinus and all these people, but broadly like the kind of a hierarchy that they end up with is consonant with non-reductive naturalism, the stuff that John Vervaeke talks about. So that's the first half of the book, arguing for that, and then the second half of the book is arguing for specifically Christian metaphysics, how it's an improvement upon non-reductive naturalism and classical metaphysics. And for that, I really think that Saint Dionysius the Areopagite had already figured all of it out, and it's just a matter of explaining it to modern people. And for that, I do use modern thinkers like C.S. Lewis and Answers von Balthasar and D.C. Schindler. I mentioned Aquinas here and there as part of the classical tradition too, but I think like the fundamentals, let's say, of Christian metaphysics are already laid out in Dionysius the Areopagite.
So it's leaning more toward the Platonists more than the Aristotelian, but it's still within kind of the mix.
Yeah. I think there's lots of arguments about this kind of stuff, but I broadly see Aristotle as a Neoplatonist, and then I think that what Plato and Aristotle did, like both of those things were integrated into later Neoplatonists, including in Dionysius and Proclus and those who preceded them.
Okay. Great. So there's a lot of different directions we could start in. I guess the first, I don't know. Where do you want to? Where would you like to start?
Yeah. I think
you don't know much about my background, so maybe that would be helpful.
I just read the article you sent me from Substack, but I think this is a good place to start.
Okay, that's fine. I've been in TLC for a while. I came in through John Vervaeke because I study AI and cognitive science, theory of mind. So I discovered him academically, and that sort of brought me into the space. And yeah, there's a handful of Jews here, not many, and even a smaller contingent of Orthodox ones. But there are a couple of us that are involved in reading Vervaeke and Peugeot to various degrees. So yeah, so it's good to meet. So well, if you just read the article, to give for people who don't know, I started a Substack like 2 weeks ago. It has like 3 articles, but one of them was, as I was prepping for this conversation, I wanted to put into words something that I talked about, when I tried to start a YouTube channel however many years ago. It's the very first video, which was the difference in my symbolic world and Jonathan Peugeot's. Because I have no issue with the concept of symbolic worlds, enchantment, fine. I think actually in some ways, depending on how you count them, Jews are either in their 3rd or 5th round of reenchantment at the moment, since the let's say 13th century. And so we've been doing this for a while. This round actually feels a lot like what I would like our 19th century round. Like the round I'm seeing in Peugeot and Vervaekean feels a lot like our 19th century round to some degree. And we can talk about that. But I think part of this is that, at least in my framing, we've gone through this before, so we've kind of learned some wisdoms on navigating this disenchantment, reenchantment cycles. And we are, and I think that's going to end up being a lot of this conversation to some degree, is not so much, you know, because in some ways, you know, yes, Jews have defied some odds on the fertility crisis, but if you look at like all Jews in general, the current rates for Jews in, I think, the US versus people who are not religious in the US on fertility are about the same, because Orthodox Jews are a small, at least in this country and most countries, are a small fragment. In this country, it's about 10% of Jews are Orthodox. And even there's distinctions that really will make a big difference in this conversation that we'll probably have to break into. So yeah, so this article was about Cain, though. This article was about, and the old videos I made and comments that people may have seen on Grail Country streams before, or Jacob's streams before. This is a very, very big difference. And I was actually really surprised when I first heard Peugeot, and I was like, once I realized he was coming out of the Book of Enoch, it helps, because I was like, oh, okay, that's where he's getting it from. Almost all Jews can today, I mean, very few Jews are aware of the Book of Enoch. Those who are understand that it is not only is it not part of the canon, but it's probably one of the books that's considered heretical by the rabbis of the second and maybe first century. That it was, and it doesn't mean that everything in it is. I mean, there's also problems with the fact that the current Book of Enoch is actually made of things, like a whole collection of different works internally, some of which were added only after the destruction of the Second Temple, some of which are actually probably added by Christians. At least the current Book of Enoch that the Ethiopians have preserved. If we look at the books, the version of the book or the versions, because they have many copies, and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Qumran, they don't have a huge section, like 30 or 40 chapters of the current book are not in that. But usually the parts that we care about, I would say, the parts that, like, in this community, Jonathan Peugeot takes from, tend to be the Book of the Giants, the Book of the Watchers, the Animal Apocalypse, I think sometimes comes up. And those are all older, though they actually do have various, they probably are not written at the same time. They were compiled together as a single work later. There's also a huge section on astronomy that's based in Babylonian astronomy that, like, is definitely older, but again, usually not considered relevant to most of our conversations here, though it is insofar as, like, it explains why Christians use a solar calendar and Jews do not. They use a lunar solar calendar, because the modern Jews were the people who survived the destruction of the temple, and the sects that survived were non-Enochic or anti-Enochic. I'll call it Enochic, like an Enochic package. So this is the Book of Enoch, certainly the first Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees. There's a couple other works, like smaller works, that probably fit into that package. We can talk about, like, why we don't accept them, but for now, the Cain story is very, very different, because in most, I think almost all Jewish interpretation of the Cain story, Cain repents and is trying to repent, and that's what he's doing after he killed, like, when he has this conversation with God, and says, the sin is too great for me to bear. That is repentance language, is saying, like, why can't you handle my sin? Like, is this really too great to bear? It's more of a rhetorical question. Is this sin too great to bear? And in many ways, it seems like God is responding, saying, like, no, I can forgive you, and and this is the way we're going to do it. And he gives him a sign, which is usually tied to something like a covenant or like some sort of miracle, right? Sign, like that specific word is important. We don't know what the sign is, and there's lots of suppositions and midrashim about what that sign might be. But he does repent, and in fact, one way to read the building of the city and his son, and his son's name especially, is that is part of his process of repentance. And in fact, that city serves perhaps symbolically as a prototype for the cities of refuge, for the murderer who didn't intend to murder, right? An inadvertent murderer can flee to a city of refuge. And it's interesting is he can't actually stay in that city. But he builds that city for his children. And he calls this both the city and his children Chanuch, which both means education and means dedication. And right, so that's this is a very different reading from the read of Jonathan Pajot, which is he's going to continue down his evil path. He doesn't really repent, or he repents insincerely. And after he's wandering, he kind of just doubles down through both him and his descendants, right? So he
I don't know if I suspect maybe I think the disagreement will be a little bit later about why the next events happen. Because I think so far all that, or I not to speak like on behalf of Jonathan, I think at least on my side, the way I would tend to see it is, and I think Jonathan would agree with this part at least, is the city as a kind of garment of skin, like an extension of what Adam and Eve received in the garden right after the fall. The city is sort of a larger scope of protection that Cain now needs because he's been expelled further down from the mountain. But it's not in itself positive or negative yet. Like I think just at this stage of the story that Cain building cities and technology, it's not clear if it's good or bad yet. It's more about like for of course, I think it becomes like in the Book of Enoch, it's really spelled out. But even if, let's say, you don't accept the Book of Enoch, my next question then is, why do you get the flood after? Like, why does God flood the world if there wasn't something wrong with the city?
So now we have to get further, right? Because by the time God floods the world, there's much more than just the city. We've had 7 generations of his. And we can talk about like what those maybe symbolize or where he gets to there. I made in that Substack article, I take an argument from a different book that in fact he is naming his kids names that are similar to his own and Abel, Hevel, and he's using these names as a way actually to redeem his brother and trying to bring his brother back into the world. And actually, this is all a redemptive act. Now that's obviously very different reading, but that's not the only thing that's leading up to the flood. One thing that happens is Lemach seems to kill somebody, maybe Cain. We don't. So Lemach has done something, right? He's singing to his wives or telling them a poem about some sin he has committed, followed by Seth being born. And we kind of have yet another 7 generations of Seth, where he names his kids basically the same names as Cain's kids, weirdly enough. I mean, and there's an entire theory here. I'm going to draw from someone else, Rabbi Grummett, who has posited that in fact Seth is copying Cain in order to, in some ways, also kind of do what Cain is doing for Abel, to kind of fix the defects in Cain's own kids and redeem them. But it's not clear for why or what. Because there's not really a tradition that they're sinning outside of Lemach. Now, Lemach clearly does something, and like we have to talk about that. But the flood itself happens, like we don't have to necessarily look at all these generations, right? The flood itself happens, it seems, because of the Bnei Elohim, the sons of. Now we can talk about what they are, whether they're angels, or for the more traditional Jewish reading, these are just the sons of the elite who are kind of abusing their power and taking women or it could be like a Sethite thing where the sons of Seth are taking the daughters of Cain inappropriately. In fact, right? That's another.
Yeah, I'm curious here. Even let's say if we don't talk about the giants in the same way that the Book of Enoch does. Is there still an association between technology and sin before the flood in your reading?
No, not at all.
So there's still some kind of sin, like for the flood to happen?
There's sin, but the sin has nothing to do with technology. The sin is relational sin.
Okay.
Right? The sin is how I'm relating to other people. It's not how I'm relating to something in the world that's inanimate, whether it's the city or technology or I mean, in Enoch, there's makeup and mirrors and all these other things they add. Whereas here, like, no, the technology is a redemption of technology, because here it's a weird word, but what he's doing with metal work is a weird word, but it basically he's either like carving or engraving metal, right? The word is either engraving or it's the word for plow, and he's actually making plows. Now that's interesting because there's this midrash that that Noach invents the plow, and not only that he invents the plow, but that his wife is the seventh generation descendant of Cain, his daughter. That there's a daughter mentioned in that chapter, right? So that daughter Naomi is actually in like in the main midrashic kind of tradition is Noach's wife. So Noach and Naomi are the redeemed final iteration of the Seth line and the Shet line, and the redeemed final iteration of the Cain line coming together, and those two seeds are going to create the new world. So it's not, you don't at all wipe out the Cain line. That's not the purpose. And in fact, in some ways, if the sin is that the sons of Seth are taking the daughters of Cain inappropriately, then Noach Naomi might in fact be a specific repair for that inappropriate taking. Like this is the appropriate way of combining and integrating those two lines compared to the inappropriate integration of the others. So that's a pretty major difference in reading. But yeah, we don't have this anti-technology thing you really don't see. And this is what's really interesting, because to some degree, you might think, Jews don't use technology on the Sabbath. Like it's like we're like Amish one day a week, in a sense. It's not quite true. We can talk about like the Amish technology restrictions versus the Orthodox Jews on Shabbat. But in some ways, like of groups that avoid technology, we present like they have converged. We've converged to them. They've converged to us, and well, beyond that. I mean, obviously, there's also other convergences in language and dress, but like the technology one, I think, is the most relevant here. But yeah, we don't have this anti-technology bent that I really see in Peugeot or through his work through Enoch.
There's like two questions I have following on that. One is, you mentioned that there were Jews who accepted the book of Enoch, but they didn't survive the temple destruction in 70 AD.
Yeah, well, so we don't. So the community of Qumran seems to have certainly accepted it at some level. We don't know if they considered it canon, but we know they liked the book. There's copies of it. That and Jubilees has lots of copies. I think there's like 11 copies. So they were definitely reading this stuff, and you can see it in so in their exegesis, which is kind of like a homiletic exegesis called the Pisharim, which is parallel to the category of Midrash in Rabbinic Judaism. Though there's some stylistic differences, whatever, but it's essentially that. And their Pisharim, they really are drawing from Enoch and Jubilees more, and we know they're using the calendar out of Jubilees. Like their calendar is the solar calendar of Jubilees. Now there's some interesting debate over whether there were some within the Pharisees, whether there were some that were Enochic or were they all anti-Enoch. There's a couple like really weak points of evidence, kind of in both directions. It seems like if you look at Josephus, and you can't always trust him on these things, he seems to say that the Pharisees kind of do not accept a lot of the major contentions of Enoch. But he doesn't necessarily say it explicitly, but when he brings up a couple of points of things that are like differences or unique to their sects, it seems like one of the things that he understands as a unique aspect of the Pharisees is they reject Enoch. Now, the rabbis are not the Pharisees. I mean, that's another important point that's often like missed. The rabbis, in fact, critique the Pharisees. If you look at rabbinic texts, they critique the Pharisees. The rabbis, though, were a group within the Pharisees. They might have actually been specifically of the scribes that tried to reform from within. There was a proto-rabbinic group before the temple was destroyed, trying to reform from within. They tend to not actually have the power to do that for a lot of the period. And there are times when there's also because there's also the intersectarian politics going on. Like a great example of this is Rabban Gamliel, who's mentioned in Acts, at the Sanhedrin, who's considered basically the head of the proto-rabbinic group within the Pharisees at this time. When the Pharisees have enough power in the Sanhedrin at the temple, in the maybe mid to late 50s, for a brief period, it seems, he does institute reforms on the price of bird offerings, specifically like the women bring that Jesus is very upset about, right? Like that actually happens, but it happens like 15, 20 years later, and through not through the Christians, but through people who stayed within the group and actually like tried to make that work politically, and they like get there at some point, but then they lose power again. More complicating to this is that almost all of the proto-rabbinic Pharisees, at least according to rabbinic texts, actually withdrew from participation in the Sanhedrin at the temple and set up a counter or alternative Sanhedrin that wasn't at the temple anymore. And like we don't exactly understand or know what the relationship of these two groups were, because like it seems in the rabbinic text, it seems like all the Pharisees leave, but then clearly some Pharisees, according to at least Acts, are still in that Sanhedrin at the temple, including maybe the leader of the Pharisees. So there's definitely some historical like fact, like sorting out here that are really kind of difficult. The proto-rabbis leave the Sanhedrin about 40 years before the temple is destroyed, which would be the year 30, which would be when Jesus starts his ministry, which means they shouldn't be involved in any of the Sanhedrins that the Christians seem to talk about, unless there wasn't quite as hard of a line between these two groups and there was more fluidity, which there might really have been both Philo and Josephus, and even I'd say some of the stuff in the New Testament points to actually quite a bit of fluidity between these groups. It wasn't like you were a card-carrying member of one that meant you couldn't be a part of another, you couldn't switch. There's clearly some movement. So there are these. So there may or may not have been any Pharisees who accepted the Book of Enoch. The Sadducees certainly would not have accepted it. The Qumran community very much accepts it. Now I understand, just like to do a little history, like I understand that John is the Baptist is downstream of the Qumran community. He has a lot of very heavy similarities with that community. He's using similar logic and thought. We can talk about whether he was like fully aligned or like an offshoot. Like that's a fair and like thing that I don't think we've figured out academically yet. And then Jesus, I think, just given the way he talks and the types of debates he's interested in, the topics he keeps coming to, the logic he uses, I really do think he's either part of this proto-rabbinic group or tangential to it, or he's certainly within the Pharisees. But then he gets interested, I think, in his cousin John's stuff. Like he hears John's doing this thing, it's his cousin. He goes and checks him out, and I think though, like he adopts a lot of this, some of the stuff from the Essenes, but he has like one foot in both camps. And like there's different arguments here. Like some people say he's like 90% of one, 10% of the other. Some people think it's more mixed. If you look at parts, there's James Tabor has a whole class on like all the parallels between the Qumran documents and the New Testament. That's you can find online, and like 12, 15 part class. It's a long course if I remember. And there's like a lot, and it's not to say there's certainly differences. Qumran cared a lot more about purity, and they did not include non-Jews. Like those are huge differences for sure. But then there are entire passages that seem to be right out of the community rule from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you're like, oh, well, that's kind of interesting. Or like how they conceive of what Messiah is, or justification. Even how Paul conceives of justification seems also very tied to Essene group. So that was an aside, but yeah. So there, you definitely have some group of Jews who consider Enoch somewhat authoritative and useful, and is informing their symbol systems. We can also, for a brief moment, we might want to talk about like why Enoch might have been rejected by other groups. So I would call it has a high degree of syncretism. Now you might say, well, the Bible deals with non-Jewish gods all the time and uses language. Yes, and that's a discussion. Enoch bears a lot of fingerprints. It has some elements of Egyptian stuff, like the lakes of fire, or like in the afterlife, or very specifically an Egyptian thing. We actually have archaeological evidence, like pieces of pagan temples from Syria, I think, or Lebanon, where we have scenes from the books of Giants and Watchers that predate the book by about 100 years, which kind of point to, hey, these were myths that were going on out in the pagan world that were then being like made, Jewish, whatever that's supposed to mean, but like brought in somehow. And then there's also a very heavy, both Babylonian and Persian. Oh, sorry, there's both Babylonian and Persian influence. There's a very high Zoroastrian influence element, which has to do with the fall of the angels and the rebellion of the angels, the dualism, of the Enochic groups, and and obviously the calendar. The calendar is a big deal. They're clearly using a Neo-Babylonian calendric system. Now, it doesn't necessarily disqualify. Like, those are all differences. And the fact that they were using a purely solar calendar might have been actually one of the biggest political political differences between them and other groups. The rabbinic or the Pharisee, whatever, the calendar that the other Jews are using, not just the Pharisees, but like it seems like all the other Jews are using, is a lunisolar calendar, which is also based on Babylonian math and calculations. So in some ways, both groups are using Babylonian calendars, or at least the math for the calendar from Babylon, but they understand the calendar to be different, right? One's lunisolar, one's solar, so we're having kind of two competing calendar systems.
I wonder if maybe something more, because I don't really even need the Book of Enoch specifically. I don't think Jonathan would.
This might be too tangential, right? This might be all too tangential. We can
maybe instead. I think what would be nice is to talk about other, because there are other like patterns of technology that match what I tend to see that we can talk about, and like how you see, let's say, how you tie the thread differently would be helpful. So
we can switch. Yeah, let's switch up. I'll just before you do that switch. So maybe we'll switch. Just switch.
Yeah. So let's say, because I don't tend to see that like necessarily technology is going to be bad, but I do tend to see it as something that we need to add to protect ourselves when we fall, and it can then be a spiral that makes us fall further. And I see examples, even if I stay within the Hebrew Bible, of places where we need to remove technology to ascend. So you already mentioned the Sabbath. I tend to see this also when Moses has to remove his sandals, has to remove the garments. I tend to see it in also in I don't know if I would say it exactly in circumcision. I think Gregory of Nyssa makes that association. But let's say, and then there's also like negative images, like when Babel is created just after the flood, that I think you would see that probably like as a bad use of technology. Like that one is right off the bat. So let's say the sandals. Why do you think Moses has to remove the sandals?
So I don't connect the sandals to the garments of skin. And one of the interesting differences, and I think Peugeot is aware of this, I think he's brought it up at least once, is in kind of Jewish imagination. The garments of skin are actually Leviathan skins. So there were two Leviathans created at the beginning of the world, and one of them was killed at the beginning, and the other one will be killed at the end, which already produces a different eschatology right there, because it's not actually right. It's not just one at the end. It's actually more U-shaped, I guess, than that. And they are given these garments, but gosh, this gets into the city, because because we connect the garments of the Leviathan skin to the walls of the Sukkah, of the Feast of Tabernacles. But those are also the clouds of glory. God's clouds of glory are protection, right? But it's not that they're technology, and I think this is the difference. And you actually almost highlighted it, because you said this is a bad use of technology. It's not the same as technology is bad. It's that technology has bad and good uses. For us, the things that we do not do on the Sabbath are all connected, and you can say, okay, it's very legalistically or symbolically or like very loose association connection, but somehow all the things that we do not allow ourselves to on the Sabbath are connected to building the tabernacle. So we have a list of like, these are the 39 categories of labor. It's not like you can't do any work. Like, there's some things we do on the Sabbath that are a lot of work, like hosting a big meal can be a lot of work, but we don't cook it on the Sabbath, right? And I think there's this equivocating between like between work and actually like what we would call malacha, which is it's a specific like work that can be used for divine purposes or holy
Is it
purposes,
the
right?
same word that, let's say, is used in like Genesis 1 or 2 when
Yeah.
Adam like has to tend to the garden?
So it's not used there. It's only used in Genesis 1, not 2.
Okay,
And it's
okay,
and it's and it's God. It's only used for God's work in Genesis
okay,
1.
okay.
So the work that we do not do in building the tabernacle, it should make sense for Pajot's frame too, because it's the same work that God doesn't do in building the
Yeah.
world, the tabernacle representing the world, and we're resting like God rested from that divine work. So it's not that we're taking a break from. It's not that we're rejecting technology and saying there's no point in technology. You need the 6 days of creation. Creation is holy for us, and it's the divine work, right? It is the divine labor, and it is the tabernacle, and it is the work to build a tabernacle. And every time I don't do something on the Sabbath, I'm avoiding doing something that could build the tabernacle. And at the same time, there's other 6 days of the week. Every time I do one of those labors, I am doing something that could be used, like that could be a labor of the tabernacle, right? So it actually sanctifies all my technological work during the 6 days of the week, but also says on the seventh day, that is not my job. On the seventh day is not my job to build the tabernacle, as holy as that work is, and as important as the work is for the tabernacle, which is building a space for God in space, building a space for God in time needs to be there too. And it's not supposed to be even all the time or most of the time. It's 1/7 of the time, but it's part of it. And there's a balance here that you're going back and forth between the possibility for holy work and the possibility for holy rest, possibility for space, God encountering God in space versus the possibility of encountering God in time, right? And we're balancing between those two. Now, yeah, we do use language like in the world to come, or the age to come. Like, is it kind of an eternal Sabbath? We do use that language, but at the same time, we when the Messiah comes, we don't believe the world like ends. Like the world keeps going when the Messiah comes for us, and like there's still labor to do. There's still, I mean, yes, there's global peace or whatever, but like we still function as a society, and we're going to live in a holy, functional sense where all these things are holistically integrated. Where we're doing the holy work we're doing. So to me, I see this as not as a rejection of technology, but as a mitigation for and a call for balance between it. And there's no real. There are statements that are anti-technology. I'd point you not so much to the shoes, because I think for the shoes case is this: the shoes is in the world you do need shoes, but sometimes when you encounter God, you need to take off your shoes, right? Sometimes, there is a point where like that, where the shoes are not appropriate, but God also gave them the clothing, whether you think it's Leviathan skins or whatever you think it is in the garden. He gave them that clothing, which I think is different also from the city. God does
But
not
you
tell
don't.
them.
Sorry, you don't. So just to be. So I'm sure I
Yeah,
follow. So you don't see a relationship between, let's say, the Moses sandals and the garments of skin that Adam and Eve get in the garden.
I don't see it like I'm not aware of a traditional connection between those two. Can I see it symbolically? Maybe, but I also see it as an integrative call, not rejective, or like that. This is like a different category. I would say where the category where I was going to go next, I think, is specifically when it talks about the strength of horses and the strength of military technology and chariots, right? So there's this recurring theme in Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, where they keep coming back to the problem of specifically technology and warfare. It's really the only area where I think there's a negative technology bent, specific, like not just like the technologies, bad in general. Like there are technologies that can be used for good and bad. I'd say Babel actually, because there's a redeemed vision of Babel in Sephania and to some degree in Isaiah. Like they see that there's a way to proclaim God in one voice in a holy way around a temple, around something that everyone built together. That's the opposite and the inversion of Babel. So the problem there isn't necessarily the technology. The problem is how humans are relating to each other and like around the technology. Maybe we can get into that. But for warfare, when it's much more like, they cut, right? They cut the tendons of horses at some point to make this point. It's a very like weird scene that I don't think most people like remember. But like there are scenes where like and God says like the king can't acquire too many horses. They defeat the chariots. God does all, both with Deborah and with the Egyptians. Like there's multiple chariot scenes where God defeats the chariots. And there it seems that the problem is not the technology, but that your hubris that comes that I can do this out of my own hand, and I don't need God's help, right? Like I'm able, and but this is not just for technology. This theme happens a lot in Tanakh, where it says, when God gives you the land, like you're going to live in houses that you didn't build and have farms that you didn't originally plant, and you're going to get the harvest from them, and you're going to think like I did these things, and no, like you didn't do these things. Even if you participated in the war, you didn't do those things. Like God was the one who was behind you winning that war. God was the one who made sure that battle, and the problem with technology, the problem with any sort of prosperity and success, and it's not to say it's anti-prosperity or success or progress, but it's saying that it always carries a danger. It always carries a danger of hubris. It always carries a danger of of ego, that you're gonna attribute it to yourself and not to God. And like the text is super aware of this danger, right? It warns them, like when you get fat, you're going to kick. When and I don't think it's a technology specific critique, but that's where the anti-technology kind of thread, I think, is strongest, is in that line.
The thing that I'm curious about is if you see, I mean, you said interesting things about the Sabbath that I hadn't tried to conceptualize this way, but I'm trying to see how, let's say, what we must do to get back to the garden. Because for me, removing the sandals is part of it. Like removing the garments of skin. Like, I think I see sort of, I keep trying in my mind to like compute ways to make the kind of like symbolic bridge that I see in the New Testament. Jesus making, like, to get back to Genesis. I try to keep finding examples in the Old Testament of making my way there. And let's say Moses removing the sandals is like one step I see. I'm trying to think of other examples. I wonder if I don't remember this well enough, maybe you do, but when building the tabernacle, let's say when Moses has the plans of the tabernacle, isn't there something about the skins going on there? Like you have different layers of skins.
There are layers of skins, yeah.
Yeah. And no, actually, that's like finding a good way to use the same, like the same skins that he had gotten rid of. Let's say,
the skins are not. I don't think the skins are the problem. It's really funny though. I just want to say, so I happen to have this book like right in front of me right now. This is the Hebrew name for Ecclesiastes. So this is literally called Kohelet, a map to Eden. So this is certainly a topic of interest. It's a fascinating book. He reads Ecclesiastes as Solomon, but Solomon associating his trouble with Adam and at the end of his life, and the failure of his son to be a good king, and inheritance. So he's reflecting on Solomon's reflecting on his own sin, and he understands this as Solomon's repentance. But Solomon's repentance by understanding himself as an Adam. Not a successful new Adam, not a second Adam the way Christians use it, but as Adam who is mourning his son Hevel, which is also the same word for vanity of vanities or futility or fleetingness, right? So the first half especially of that book is fantastic. So and in fact, if you looked at the Substack article before the one I sent you, the second one I wrote was actually exactly about what was the work that Adam had to do in the garden. He has two parts to that work, right? He's supposed to work at lavod, which is not the same work for the Sabbath, and to preserve or guard lishmor. Now that word is important because that is a word that we associate with the Sabbath in the giving of the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy, but it's not the same word it's used in the Ten Commandments in Exodus. And that's an important Jewish symbolic point, that we actually have two aspects of the Sabbath, to preserve and to remember. The garden also has these two sides, which is to preserve and to work. And the role of the priests and the Levites in the tabernacle, the priest's work is called the avodah, is the same word from Adam, and the preserving or guarding is the role of the Levites. And it's very specific and like separating those two things out. And in that other article, I actually talk about how the purpose of the tabernacle, in some sense, seems to be, how do you take the garden, not go back to the garden, but how do you make the garden mobile and bring it out into the world? And that should make some sense. And in some ways, it parallels the tablets, where the first garden is the shattered tablets, and the new garden, the tabernacle, is the whole tablets. Right? This is the tablets that can exist in reality and are not too rigid. Like they're able to, like they're not too much of the divine to not coexist with human frailty. Right? At the same time, like it still requires, to have that garden moving into the world requires a lot of layers, a lot of both clouds and garments of skin, and all sorts of things, veils, curtains, right, mirrors, right. There's all these things that to take the garden and move it out into the world. I do think, insofar as the tabernacle represents the Garden of Eden, like you have the two cherubs, and the cherubs between them in the garden is the ever turning sword, or the whatever you want to call it, and beyond that is the tree of life. And in the tabernacle, you have the voice of God that issues from between the two cherubs, under which is the covenant, right? It's the Ark of the Covenant, but the covenant is the tree of life there. And this gets into Psalms using the tree of life language to describe the Torah and the covenant, right? And the Brit. So both the covenant is part of the Torah, but right, we would have to differentiate a lot of words here. But those are in the ark, or next to the ark. Those are what the cherubs are over, and they give you access. Like God's voice kind of draws you into that space, but then that space is also cut off from any access except for one time a year, right? So Moses isn't even really actually there when he's receiving this stuff. He's not in front of the ark. He's actually in the next level out of the tabernacle. And it says, because this is one of these interesting areas, because in the end of Exodus it says that he's hearing God's voice from in front of the tent, or in front of the structure that's in the middle of the tent, the heichal. So he's in front of that. But then it says God's voice is actually issuing from between the cherubs and is coming out to him, right? So that's the beginning of Leviticus. And then in Numbers, you have these 3 verses that sort of are implying that it's projecting outward toward him. So the map back to Eden, in some sense, there's a question of whether actually that's the goal. Is the goal to get back to Eden? Is the goal to get back to the first tablets? Or is the goal actually a unique thing that has to do with how we bring the tabernacle out into the world, which may now be the temple? We can talk about whether those are equivalent, because the tabernacle is mobile, and that's like a really important aspect of it. But the temple, in some ways, takes that and becomes a new fixed point, Garden of Eden, except it's not the garden. Like now it's a city, and now the people who are doing the guarding are the Levites, and the preserving and the work are the Levites and the priests. And Eden has been renewed or reclaimed as Jerusalem, where animals are at peace again, and like all of you know this symbolism, I'm sure. So like we don't necessarily have to repeat it.
There's many questions I would have as a follow-up. It's hard for me to pick the best one. I guess one thing I'd be curious is how you see Rome, because one of the ways in which like it easily maps out, if I use the like Enochian kind of symbolism I mentioned earlier, is that like there are many parallels between Cain and Rome, like the founding of the city of Cain and the founding of Rome. And then like that's going to obviously play an important role in how Christians think, at least we think, that we fixed the problems that were set up in Genesis. So how do you guys see Rome?
So Rome is so this is interesting, and Rome and Greece are going to be separate here, because Greece is understood as a child of Yefet, which is back one of Noah's three kids, right? So Noah has three sons, and Shem and Yefet are supposed to work together. They're supposed to dwell like one, one is dwelling, right? Yefet dwells in the tent of Shem, I think. Is that it? So like there's some sort of mutual relationship there, though they're not exactly doing the same thing, but like they're supposed to work together. And that symbolism has allowed some degree of Greek and Jewish thought engagement, though nowhere near as much as Christianity. And there's still a lot of hesitancy around what Greek thought can be brought in. What's an acceptable amount? And it's not just amount, but also like is theology a different thing than science? So we are much more comfortable bringing in science than we are theology from outside, because theology is via revelation, and we don't think the Greeks had revelation, which is different. I understand that there's at least strains within Christian history that actually did think that there was some level of revelation, maybe a low one, but something accessed by the philosophers that sort of made that like acceptable or kosher for Christians, where we don't have that. Now there is a different way to do this that you see in some of the Jewish Middle Platonists, and then onward. So Aristobulus, and then in Philo and Josephus, and then into the Church Fathers, which actually says that Plato actually had a chain of transmission from Pythagoras, maybe from Moses to Plato, maybe through, or maybe not through Pythagoras. And that sort of makes a perennial history that allowed like a different way of like getting some Greek thought through. But the Romans are different. The Romans are associated with Asav. This is a very big difference, because that doesn't just mean that Rome is like one of the 70 nations. No, Rome is actually like Jacob's twin, right? And in some ways, there's a lot of reasons for this. Part of it has to do with Asav in Jewish symbolism, even before Rome, being associated with war and hunting and Mars and the color red. And like a lot of this kind of very, like the symbol, this military symbol of Rome really came through into Asav. It also has to do with Herod being like, he was the one who really brings Rome, like, even though technically he's not, what's his name? The Hasmoneans appealed to he was in competition with Caesar. He's one of the three. I can't remember his name. Anyway, he was involved in the Mark Antony story. He comes in. He's like, the two Hasmoneans, brothers are fighting over the throne. They can't agree on who. They appeal to Rome. Rome sends him, and he basically says, you know what? Neither of you get it. I'm taking over. And that's how Rome takes Judea, essentially. But despite that, it's really with Herod, who is this child of an Edomian, so someone from Edom, right, from Esav's line, and he becomes the representative of Roman rule, even though he's not technically, though he is a citizen, but whatever. He basically represents Rome to the Jewish people. That allows a transmission where Rome becomes Esav. And that's going to be super important, because the relationship between Esav and Jacob is not the relationship of Ishmael and Isaac, and is not the relationship. And the New Testament goes in a different direction, right? The New Testament likes the Ishmael Isaac one, and it wants to say that we're Isaac, the people of the new early proto-Christian community are Isaac, and the people who are not following us are Ishmael. So we're definitely seeing those, like, people are using similar language, but like, who's who is certainly happening. I think there's a difference when you're applying it kind of internally to like, we're children of Abraham, versus externally to non-Abraham. I think one of the things that helps the Roman association with Esav was they became Christian. When they became Christian, now we're talking about a fellow Abrahamic religion, so it's a lot easier to see it as under Abraham, where I don't quite actually know how this metaphor worked when Rome was still mostly pagan. I get why they were going there in that direction, but like it doesn't seem to work as well. Once Rome goes Christian, though, it becomes very obvious. And then we have like a very strong foundation of like, we're both Abrahamic faiths. Rome, and by Rome I mean all of Christianity, becomes like, for us, we're not, and I'm not using Rome as Catholic specific. Rome also means the Eastern Christians, and that all becomes Esav, and that's not that doesn't have any of the city associations. It also ties it up in lots of different ways with Amalek, because Amalek descends from Esav too. So that means you have the Haman story, you have the Amalek stories in Saul. Those all play more of a role specifically around Rome in a way that you wouldn't have had if it didn't have that association. At the same time, Rome is, as a city, is sort of seen as an anti-Jerusalem. Now, earlier, like in the Tanakh, that anti-Jerusalem is Babylon. And the language that of the daughters of Babylon and stuff like that are applied in Tanakh, and I know Christians especially, like, they take that and they know that gets applied to Rome, though some of those actually probably really are meant for Jerusalem, and it's probably being misapplied to Rome in some of the exegesis I've seen. But this is the fallen Jerusalem. This is the Jerusalem of, well, that Jeremiah is berating, right? That's really like, or Ezekiel, right? Like, and they're trying to like get them to, well, usually they try and get them to repent using this language. Not always. Sometimes God has said there's no point. Repenting won't do anything at this point. But that's a very different. So let's get back. I want to go back to the article. So I want to go back to this point. With the things that you associated with cities, I think in Tanakh are actually not as much critiques of cities, though I think to some degree they are, especially in Genesis. But I think they're more critiques of kingdoms and empires. I think they're critiques of, but we can say some of them are cities, right? Because you have in Egypt, it's not associated with a city. It's just called Egypt, and it's just like Egypt is bad. And the Mesopotamians are just bad, and we have the kingdoms that Nimrod is setting up. With, even though they're called by city names, it's Assyria and it's Babel, and it's like very clearly pointing to imperial, like cities that are at the focus of empires, right? At the same time, we do have a couple cities that are just like bad as cities without the need for being bigger. The big ones are the 5 cities of the plain, Sodom and Amorah and their sister cities, and Shechem, right? So Shechem at the end of Genesis, where Dinah gets taken, the daughter of Jacob, and it's clear there, right? So there is a critique of, but in all these cases, it's almost all of them. The person who's called out is the king, with the exception of Sodom, where the people are called out. Everywhere else, it's the king are called out. And I would also say we should also add in, is it Ekron, the city of the Philistines that both Abraham and Isaac go to, right? So he's afraid that the people of that place don't respect sexual boundaries, right? And this is the major critique of cities in Genesis. Is, well, there's 2. One of them, neither of them are about technology. One of them is about that cities are places that have bad sexual values, where women are taken, either they're seduced or they're raped or they're just taken. And that is the problem of the pre-flood, right? That is the sons of the B'nai Elohim taking the daughters of man, right? That is sort of what's still happening in these cases. And that spirit hasn't been quenched yet. And where it's popping up is specifically cities. And that, I think there you do get that line. The other place where you get a technology kind of bent is, not technology, sorry, the city critique is around justice. I think that's the way I'd frame it, right? So like what is fair for kings to impose on their subjects? And you see this with the alliances in the War of the 9 Kings, and kind of the bargaining of the king of Sodom that he tries to do with Abraham. And like, he says, give me is it about the people? Is it about the property? Like, what is he trying to take? What does Abraham not want? He doesn't want to be associated with any of this deal making, basically. And there's also in Shechem where they work out, they're trying to convince the people like the leaders of Shechem are trying to convince the people to do this deal with the sons of Jacob, because they took Dinah, and like they're trying to like work out this whole diplomatic thing, and then they impose circumcision on everybody, which was not like, it was a trick, and it wasn't necessary, and it was like a misuse of this technology, right, in many ways. So I think I see those there, but I think they're more about fairness and sexual values than I think they are about technology.
Yeah. I think I'm actually I don't know if maybe it's not clear in the article, but I don't blame technology per se, but I think like technology gives us a lot more power and potentiality. Like there's more stuff we can do, and then I think it's fairly clear that the line you see when people have more options is they will tend to do stuff like sexual sins, as you mentioned, and so like technology or the city, like people being closer also affords that kind of access, and then
being strangers to each other too, right? You have a lot of people who don't know each other, so you don't have the same social protection.
Yeah, and then I guess it would be interesting to keep talking about that stuff. I have a lot more questions, but I am also curious, just to be mindful of time and to talk about the other aspect, is then how to handle the situation. Because I do see that at least the early Christians managed to like fix a lot of stuff in Rome. I see Christians from groups who are arguably doing it, but also as a group, I see Orthodox Jews as being able to manage it, avoid a lot of the issues that I see in cities, or like the stuff that modern technology allows. So I'm sure you have thoughts about this.
Lots of thoughts, so I think first there's survivorship bias, because the majority of Jews are not Orthodox Jews, and the people who have kind of survived and stayed Orthodox have developed and adopted a lot of different tools and technologies, or psychotechnologies, I don't even know, wisdoms. But they're navigating the same thing, because in many ways, Christianity, Western Christianity at least, like the Catholics and Protestants in real time were working through the Industrial Revolution, even before that, the Enlightenment with the Renaissance. In some ways, Jews were participating in some of that, but they were also fairly isolated from a lot of it because of just the structure of medieval and pre-modern kind of Jewish communities, or early modern Jewish communities. And then in the mid-19th century, or even the early 19th century with Napoleon, Napoleon has this idea, it predates him. The idea is Jews can actually we're going to create nation states where everyone is citizens of the country, and it's not going to be like these little autonomous groups, and like, we're not going to, and Jews aren't going to just get to manage themselves anymore. Muslims aren't going to get to manage themselves anymore. Protestants and Catholics they're all going to form nations as one, in one space. And that means before this, Jews could not be citizens of countries, right? We weren't allowed to serve in armies. Some places we weren't allowed to own weapons. Some places we weren't allowed to own land. Like there was different restrictions in different places. But the big one here is we weren't part of the country. We couldn't go to the universities except outside of Italy. Italy was the one exception where Jews could go to university. And Italian Jews are kind of have a very different development track because of that. But outside of there, it's really everything, like the 150 years or so leading up to the 1850s basically hits Judaism all at once in the 1840s, 1850s. And that's in part because even though Napoleon had these plans in the 1790s or early 1800s, they didn't really happen that early. There was lots of pushback against Napoleon, obviously. They fought him, they beat him, the other monarchs. So, but in the 1840s and 50s, you start with the German wars, right? So the civil wars, and then in the Italian reunification, and then also in England, where they have a Toleration Act, they really start allowing Jews to participate much more fully. And even leading up to that, for about 100 years leading up to that, especially in Western Europe at least, if Jews wanted to participate in society, and a growing number wanted to, they would just convert. That was the only way to do it. If you wanted to go to university, if you wanted to go become the best doctor, lawyer, have the right connections in government, you became either a Lutheran or an Anglican or whatever your state religion was. It was much more common outside of the Catholic realms, to be fair. It was much easier in the Protestant world. And this is how, in fact, Paul van der Klee's, male line ancestor converted from Judaism. He became a Calvinist. He became Reformed because that was kind of a very common thing. And also for marriage, right? If you wanted to marry someone who wasn't Christian or Jewish, whatever, you had to convert to their thing. So lots of young people kind of left in that assimilation, I'd call phase or whatever, conversion phase. And then, and their descendants kind of followed the path of everyone else who were in those societies. There were people who said no, who refused that, but then they became citizens, whether they wanted to or not. Now, that was interesting because one of the rabbis of Chabad at the time, he was the third rabbi of Chabad, the Alter Rebbe. This is earlier, actually. So France was coming. Napoleon was coming to Russia, and he was one of most Jews wanted Napoleon to come. Like, they were like, our lives suck. They weren't necessarily thinking about like what emancipation, that's what the word is, meant for them to become citizens, but they really wanted him to come. This rabbi who was a major rabbi, was really opposed to it. He was like, this is going to destroy Judaism. If we become citizens, because we'll just get absorbed into these societies, we'll end up with all the problems that they have. And in some ways, he was right. It just didn't happen when he thought it did. It would take another 50, 60 years. And then it didn't reach Russia really until way later, like right before the revolution, basically, because they were not interested in giving Jews any of these rights for the most part. But in some ways, so when you say like, oh, the Orthodox Jews have survived this, in many ways, like that has happened because everyone was Orthodox 200, let's say, years ago or so, 250 years ago. I mean, they were all like different level. It's sort of like, they were kind of like the Eastern Orthodox today, where you have like an ethnic church and there's some people who are very pious and some people who aren't, but they're all in the same framework. Once you have emancipation and then you start getting things like Jewish denominations. We didn't have denominations before that. We had geographic differences, like the world of the Jews of Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe and North Africa and the Middle East were different. Like, they had some different customs that evolved. There's different foods and languages, but then you have like the rise of non-Orthodox Jews, and suddenly you go from 100% Orthodox Jews of various, or traditional. Let's not call them Orthodox, because Orthodox might be seen as a denominational term at this point, but traditional Jews, and suddenly everything fractures. And now there's a lot of this reorientation happening. And this is what I was saying, like when we went through this disenchantment and re-enchantment kind of in the mid-19th century, that's what this was. Because the Reform Jews, they call themselves Reform after Reform, like Calvinists, like Lutheran Christians, they want to make a denomination. They want to have like a creed and platform, and like, this is, what we stand for. And they like, we're going to use modern stuff to like say, this is the symbols of Judaism. We understand the symbols, and we don't need like the ritual in the same way anymore because we have the symbols, like we can embed it or disembody it from the rituals. So they kind of, and because they're like doing a very Enlightenment style analysis, right? They're going through and saying, okay, well, this means this, and this is this, and we do this because it's about cruelty to animals, and we keep kosher because of health, and they presume to know why the commandments like are for all of their, and they just say that this is what this means, and this is why they're not going to do this. And there's pushback by the neo-Orthodox Germany, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, who pushes back and says like, that's not how this works. And he focuses on pedagogy. And he's like, he's going to still use the vernacular. He's going to publish exegesis in the vernacular and like do things which were not previously done so much, doing things in the vernacular. But at the same time, he is going to try to reach those and say like, no, like you need embodiment and you need the symbolism to live around you, and you need to like actually live it out for these things to work. You can't just like dissect it. And
so is the point, let's say overall, that like it's not clear that like something that we today called Orthodox Judaism is what has been like successfully carrying that group for the past 200 years. And that it could be more that, like from all the Jews that were there, let's say 150 years ago, 200
Mm-hmm.
years ago,
Yeah.
a subsection of them managed to survive. That subsection of them is currently like managing to be both like technological and have a sustainable fertility rate. And in the same way, if we took, let's say, I don't know, Christians from 200 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
and you looked at the groups that are now, let's say, the most conservative, those are also integrating technology and have a decent fertility rate.
Yeah, to some degree. I mean, so the part of that is that the groups that survived are very different. So, like, it's not just that the Neo-Orthodox survived. At the same time as all that was happening, the Hasidim were having their own thing that were going on in Eastern Europe and create a whole other model of survival. And in the German Jewish Academy, the Jewish Theological Seminary, like comes up comes up kind of with its own way of surviving. And there are many groups that survived, all of which most of which we now characterize the intellectual descendants of those groups are the ones that form Judaism today. That I would probably classify them under 4 major headings, with the exception of the Jewish Theological Seminary, which became conservative Judaism essentially, but became its own denomination once it moved to America. In Europe, it wasn't really its own denomination, but in America, where it was differentiating itself from Reform, it became a denomination, like officially and formally. And then it sort of went the way of the academy, which shouldn't be surprising because it was a very academic institution, and is now wrestling with much of the same kind of things that I would say like the Lutheran German Academy has wrestled with over the past 200 years and kind of where it's ended up. So the 4 major classes, so we have to differentiate because Jews today, the Orthodox Jews today, fall under what I would call kind of traditional, which is people who are kind of living, obviously they're still in the modern world and they're not rejecting anything in the modern world, but they are much more flexible. They're in communities that kind of have a much more wide range of practice. There's no, dogma, creedal, whatever tests to like be part of it. It's just like you think that this is the right way to practice Judaism. You don't always practice it the right way. And you see that a lot in Sephardi communities or in Mizrahi communities. So the communities that are geographically kind of still identified as opposed to denominationally. So that may be Iraqi Jews or Yemenite Jews, Moroccan Jews. And they form a huge part of, like, a lot of those immigrants ended up in Israel. So a lot of Orthodox Jews in Israel are really of this, what we call a traditional camp. And they wouldn't they would differentiate. They would say that they are not datim. Datim would be like, we're not religious, like a capital R religious. We're like traditional, observant Jews. And they're like a huge, I think that's like 20 or 25% of Israel. Like we're talking about like a very large fraction. Then you have like the people who call themselves like Dati in Israel. Here they'd be called, they'd probably use capital O Orthodox. And then there's kind of 3 groups within that, which sort of has some bleed over. There's the Hasidim, and the Hasidim include groups like Chabad, but also groups that I would say are more to the right or more anti-technology than Chabad. Chabad is very pro-technology. There are Hasidic groups that are much more anti-technology. There's kind of the yeshivish world, sometimes called Litvish because of Lithuania. They come out of the Lithuanian kind of intellectual, Jewish Lithuanian tradition. And then there is modern Orthodox. Modern Orthodox very explicitly is trying to do the balance between the modern world and the traditional world with integration of technology. And that's sort of where I came out of. And Israelis are a little bit different because in Israel, it's a non-Orthodox. Instead, there's religious Zionists, and they're not exactly the same group. In Israel, the religious Zionists are much more influenced, but they're by different thinkers, especially mystical thinkers. And their messianism is much more tied into their relation to the mystical tradition, into Kabbalah, in a way where in the U.S., modern Orthodox Jews tend to be much more Maimonidean, so you can think of them as a little bit closer to like Aquinas is the best parallel, right? with like Aristotelian, Thomistic. It's very skeptical of Wu, of Kabbalah, the mystical traditions. And there's obviously there's like smaller groups that kind of blend these things. There are groups within modern Orthodoxy that have rediscovered Kabbalah and are integrating it. I'm probably closer in that camp these days. There are parts of the other movements, like the liberal and reform, conservative and reform movements, that have also picked up like elements of mysticism, even though like that would have been very much not what they would have wanted 150 years ago, 200 years ago, but they've become, parts of them have become, let's say, re-enchanted, right? So there's this balance where there are groups within Orthodox Judaism today where like they do not have a computer in their house. Only probably the father, maybe the mother, has a phone. That phone is going to be probably a kosher phone, so it means like it's been modified where it has like only certain apps and access, and filters are already put on it, and like all this stuff. And kids will, if you go to a Hasidic neighborhood in New York, like you will see kids playing 1950s American children games. They'll be playing the clapping games. They'll be, skipping, like a lot of hopscotch and jump rope and jacks, right? Like they have different, there'll be like somewhat little differences, and there'll be like European versions or American sometimes, but that's really what's survived because they don't let their kids have, they don't have tablets, they don't have technology in the house, but they don't have TVs. Having a TV is a huge, like there's schools that will not let you be part of their school if you have a TV in your house. Okay, like they take
do I remember correctly that still the Hasidim in the US, like most of the, let's say, the men work and they might have technological jobs and that kind of stuff. It's just that like at home for the kids, they don't let a lot of that stuff in.
Yeah. So, well, this is also, this is true both for the yeshivish and the Hasidic worlds. And I'm just going to combine them. In the US, unfortunately, they're called ultra-Orthodox, which is not a great term. In Israel, the term is the Haredim. So the Haredim, kind of combining these two terms, are both kind of equally strict on technology. There's little variances here and there. They also are going to be very strict on interactions with non-Jews. Only certain people are going, like within the community, are going to probably do that. It may not be the men, because you should not assume the men work. Lots of men.
Not in Israel, right? In the US,
in the US and in Israel, many men in this world stay in yeshiva, just kind of like the equivalent of staying in grad school, for like 8 or 10 years after marriage, right? So they're getting married at 18 or 20, maybe 21, 22, and then they're going to stay until their early 30s, basically just learning Torah or Talmud or the law codes and all that stuff. And usually the wives work. At the same time those wives work, they also have like 6 to 11 kids, right? So like how that works is like really interesting and complicated, right? Because women are going to schools, but a lot of these schools are either virtual, online, correspondence. Some of them are in person, but they're not full time. They're certainly not PhD programs. Like we're talking about, they're going to work. Maybe they're 1-year training programs or 2-year training programs. There's a massive amount of community support. Day schools, like, right?
Families must be closer than the average American family.
Right. We also live, like, so modern Orthodox Jews are different. Like, and this is part of the thing. My modern Orthodox Jews, like, many of them do have TVs in their home. Many of them have computers. Many of them have tablets. Many of them have phones. They're having, closer to like 3 to 5 kids, which is still high, but it's not the same level as, it's not on average the same as the Haredim. In religious Zionists in Israel, I think the average family size, I think their average is 5 kids, so it's a little bigger than in the US. And I think the religious Zionist community also is pretty open to its technology. They see that technology can be redeemed, it can be used in holy ways, you have to be careful with it, you put limitations on it, more than just the Sabbath. But like, there's not an anti-technology movement, whereas you do find more anti-technology like within the Haredi world for sure. Anti-AI, anti-computers, anti-internet, anti-phone, right? Like they had like all these campaigns over the years to varying success or failure. I think the TV one probably was the most successful, and it has not been as successful since then. but they try, and they're really working hard on that. The other thing is, like, we have these rules. Like, so for instance, we have to be able to walk to synagogue. Like, so that means, and usually that means with kids. So you're talking about, you
Yeah.
probably have to live within a mile of your synagogue to do that, which means that even in cities, we tend to cluster really densely.
Yeah.
So you end up creating a village within the city, right?
Yeah, that's a good rule.
And right, one, it means that because we're walking on the Sabbath. I mean, we're not driving, right? That's part of this, is that because you need to get to synagogue on the Sabbath, and you can't drive there. So how do you do that? And that's kept us basically creating these villages within cities pretty consistently, and that helps a lot. We also basically manage all our own education, right? So we, for a long time, Jews used public schools in the U.S., but over time, especially post World War II, they set up lots and lots of Jewish parochial schools and daycares, and there's a massive network for that, and that isn't necessarily, on the one hand, it helps, as it helps instill the values and like do all the things like that you want. At the same time, like, it adds an extra cost burden. So kind of one of the things, it's like, even if on average, and like, we can talk about it explicitly, like on average, Jews tend to economically be above average in most of the countries they live in, but Orthodox Jews kind of take on a lot of extra costs to do that, and so they end up like this is one of our own internal challenges. It's like, we don't see converts, but occasionally we have people who want to convert, and like the requirements to live within walking distance of a synagogue, and to like be able to afford sending your kids to Jewish day school, can be a real barrier for conversion, like a serious one, because it'll be like, I don't know that I can lift up my life and do that. Like, there aren't Jewish communities in every city or every town, right? Like, that's a huge ask.
And maybe I have a follow-up about this, because it's something that I actually think about quite a lot. My wife and I decided explicitly to live close to our parish. Like, we do, like, we walk to mass every day with the kids. So we wanted really to be close, because we knew that once we had kids, like, we wouldn't go to mass every day. So we made the conscious decision to and also come to a parish that actually has good facilities to have kids there every day. Like some churches you go to, it would be pretty difficult to bring your kids frequently. So anyway, we did that, but a challenge that we have is, as you said, it's pretty expensive to live here, and we because we need to, in Quebec there are few places where they still have mass every day. So you need to be essentially in a fairly big city to do that, and it's expensive. So my wife and I were ready to do make sacrifices for that, but we have lots of friends, even good Catholics, who don't want to make that kind of sacrifice. You don't need to. There's no rule in Catholicism that you have to go to mass every day, and you need
to. You only have to go once a week, right?
Yeah, only on Sunday, and you can just take, if it's just 1 day a week, it's fine. Even if it takes 30-minute car ride, it's not the end of the world. If the houses are 25%, 50% the cost, it could be worth it. So that's what lots of people end up doing. But I see that very directly tying to the problems of community, and even showing up in the birth rate statistics, because what happens is, we don't see our Catholic friends that often. We see some who live close by. But typically what happens is, those who live close by, they're either students because we're right next to the university, or they're still young enough that they live with their parents who do live close because their parents are more wealthy. But a lot of them, when they'll get older, get married, have kids, they'll probably move away too. So it's really hard to build something. Even I think abstractly, more people are starting to realize that you need to be physically close with others, especially when you have kids, because you're so stretched on time that if you're not within walking distance of other families, you're probably not gonna see them that often. So it's forming actually physically close communities is something I think a lot about. And then the question I have is, logistically, I don't know if logistically is the right word, but how is it that Jewish communities, such as the one you mentioned, the Orthodox and the Haredim, manage to do it? There's two things, I guess. There's one, valuing enough the faith to want to do it, and two, like technically being able to earn enough money to do it. So you need those two aspects, and I don't see a lot of people around me in Christian circles who are managing to do that, especially not at the level of like a significant community. So how have you guys managed it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know, and I think we're still working on this because it's a challenge. I think part of it is, so in theory, our men are obligated to go to synagogue 2 to 3 times a day because for all our prayers. Not that everyone comes, but like, and it's not at the same level of obligation, I think, that Catholics have, like for the weekly mass even, but that certainly helps, and like that, that you are expected to the men are expected to show up for the community twice a day to make that prayer quorum, is like a real pressure drive that helps kind of hold things. I would say there's also, I mean, the old joke, right? I don't know. I don't know what's in Canada versus here. I don't know what jokes you'll be aware of, but like the old joke is that like Jewish moms always were pushing their kids to become lawyers and doctors, until really, really recently. And I'd say lawyers, actors, and rabbis, because really in the Orthodox world, being a rabbi, which is not paid well, but like is its own status and being a part of the community. So like that was real. Like in many ways, like that joke was like, yeah, like you do need to aim high in the education system that's available to you, because like that's the way that you're going to afford to be part of this community. Now that's changed over time. I'm sure there's different jobs that paid, different better things now. Real estate maybe is like one, but like I think there is a pressure to, and then this is a real challenge for our artists, Jewish kids who are inclined to the arts in the U.S. Or in North America, I think in general, really have felt this in a way that hasn't been the case necessarily in Israel or in parts of Europe. So in parts of Europe, the religious schools are not private schools, and you don't have to pay like private school tuition to attend them. Like it's just like we have state, church schools for Christians, and like Jews are going to be given X amount of money per student to set up parallel schools for their kids. That is a model in some places. That is not the model in the U.S. In the U.S., it's like private school. You're paying private school tuition, but there's also a massive amount of philanthropy going on that actually allows that to happen, because a lot of people cannot afford those right things. So you have to have financial aid, and that's like a serious discussion where like every school that I attended, that my kids have attended so far, right, like has a serious financial aid program that and there's still a really strong culture of philanthropy in this. And I think part of this might be, this might be different. You can tell me about Catholicism, but like the money that's given is given often for your local community. It's not going off we don't have a Rome, right? You're not sending, I mean, we do have Israel, and people do support charities in Israel, but there's no centralized thing for distribution of tithes in the way that Catholics have. And there's also like, you're not giving most of your money through your synagogue. You're giving money to causes, but like a lot of them are going to be local causes. And there's like, but there is a really serious, people giving. I mean, it's not specifically 10%. It's like that's 10% has to do with the temple. We don't, where the temple isn't around, but people do give significant portions of their wealth, the people who do make it and are successful, to support these things. And it may not be schools, it might be the synagogues, it might be for the rabbi's salary, but it also is for, we have free loan societies. So these are loans that you can get that are interest free, right? We're not allowed to charge each other interest. So we have these free loan societies. We have these gamachim. They're, what would you call them? They are places. So like if you're going to donate your, let's say, clothes, you might donate it to this, and it's a place where people can just get free clothes. But the difference is, as opposed to like giving it to, just goodwill or something, is that these are internal to the community. So they're going to actually be clothes that fit our modesty standards, right? Like that fit the current fashions and styles, whatever, within the community. Some of them are specialized. So there's like a wedding dress one. So if you can't afford your own wedding dress, you can go to one of these. You can get a wedding dress that's only been used once. But there's like there's tons of these for like lots of different specific things, depending on the size of the community. But like some of them, have baby gear, right? So they'll have cribs and strollers and that is like these hidden, often women run support networks of that are just like part and parcel of being within this community. Burial too. So like if you can't afford burial, we have free burial societies, right? So that is charity like that supports that. Hospitals. So we use the hospitals. That's a long history in North America because Jews were not allowed to use the hospitals, and we had our own hospitals. That's gone now, thank God. But we still need kosher food in hospitals, and a lot of hospitals don't provide that. So like there are rooms in many major cities in the US where Jewish groups have like dedicated a room in a hospital that like has prayer books, because it's not going to be the chapel. The chapel has Christian stuff. It does not have anything Jewish. So like it's a separate room that has stuff if you're there over the Sabbath. So it'll have like a copy of the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew, probably in Hebrew and English. It will have prayer books. It will have kosher food, and a kosher microwave or something that you can heat it up in, so that like you're not stuck there. Right. So we have like all of these mechanisms that we've kind of adapted for city life, that work especially well in North America and to some degree, I think England, and some of the other, but like it requires a huge amount of tolerance, right? Like I could totally see like that, even in today's world, even in the modern West, like there will probably be places that are super not comfortable with this. We would not set up a separate room or a separate, like whatever to allow you guys to do your thing over there while we do our stuff here. So we've definitely like worked with the structures in the US, worked with what's allowed, what's not allowed, what people are willing to do and not, and kind of to the best of our ability. That's like it requires a huge amount of commitment. I mean, to your point, it's not just money. I've been focused on kind of the money for this and the philanthropy, but it's a huge amount of commitment and people like trying to figure out like what are the needs of the community that are unmet and like really working. I mean, Hatzalah is a great example, right? So there's this Jewish ambulance service. It's separate from the general ambulance service. We still use them. In the neighborhoods where Hatzalah works, they save Jewish and non-Jewish lives. They don't differentiate at all. They only work in certain neighborhoods because that have this density of Jews, right? But they respond way faster than the normal ambulances. And they have training to deal with the population specific to their neighborhood, that usually secular cops or fire departments or EMTs don't have. And like that, and they're a huge and important organization that save lots of lives, and they don't discriminate between Jews and non-Jews, but like for them to be able to even set up a private ambulance service, like isn't possible in many countries that are heavily state-run, centralized. Like you have to do it through this government thing, and you can't have your own. But like we still operate in some ways like we're in medieval Europe. We have our own security teams. We have our own, right, like especially for synagogues. And
it's super interesting. It's all super interesting, and like there's two layers of questions or comments I have. One is that in the article I don't go into lots of specifics because I do see that largely there are lots of small logistical puzzles that vary a lot, like family to family and community to community. Mm-hmm. And I think what we mostly need is to figure out the structures we need so that we figure out then like the logistics at the right like community and family level. And like one of the things I'm hearing you say is the pressures that you have to live close to synagogue is doing a lot of work, and I think something like that Christians will also have to do to make it through this. But what my follow-up question then is, because I tried to do a kind of genealogy in the article, but I'd be curious to know what, let's say, are the things that Jews have been doing for, let's say, the past centuries to prepare them so that today they can do all of this like
Yeah.
logistically challenging things? Because what you said is a lot of difficult things to figure out.
Yeah.
What prepared you guys to do this over the last 2 centuries?
It's a good question. I think so. The expectation, not just of living close, but the philanthropy expectation, I think, is very old, and it has different levels. I mentioned earlier that like a lot of men stay like basically in school for like 8 to 10 years after they get married into their early 30s.
After that, what do they do? By the way, do they get like normal jobs?
How do they survive? Right. So like, how does that happen? Right. Like, how does that work?
Yeah.
So usually, this is a super interesting and complicated dynamic. It's usually paid for by their father-in-law. And this is part of kind of like almost a dowry system. But it's also a way to ensure the passage of generational wealth. But it's not within family. It's like, it's mixing between the families, right? So this is not the world I inhabit. So I can only talk to it kind of a little bit from the outside, but I'm closer to it, so I can tell you a little bit about it. This is the Haredi world, part of the Haredi world at least, where the parents of the couple may even like buy them their first, or at least do the down payment or whatever on their first apartment, and they will fund them, at least until the wife gets a job, or at least augment her income enough. So that, and then eventually that guy is kind of, what happens when he leaves that school? Because he doesn't have a degree in anything except maybe like a rabbinic one, but he's going to, so either he's going to follow something, go like right back into the Jewish community, contributing the stuff that he has learned by being a rabbi for the community. But rabbi, I don't mean necessarily having a congregation, right? Like it could be teaching at a school. It could be like a nonprofit running one of these philanthropies. It could be adult education, right? Like there's a lot of different things that rabbis do beyond the chaplains, beyond the direct community. Or he might get a job working with his father-in-law. That's actually, or father. Those are pretty common, where they bring you into their business, teach you the ropes. And that way, and then as they age, you kind of take it over. And then now with modern technology and stuff, there are people who have set up schools for adult learners, for these men and women, separate schools for men, separate schools for women, that are, let's say, in IT, in physical therapy, in these won't be things that you need a college degree for, and they're not going to be things like truck driving, which takes you too far, and you're traveling too much to the community. Yeah. Though there are jobs that are so the kosher food. So making sure all food is kosher takes a huge amount of people. Almost all of them are men. They tend to be unmarried, or if they're married, to be on the younger side, or sometimes they're retirees. But they have to do a huge amount of travel, and they have to go to places where there are no Jews. They have to go to places where all the food factories and farms are, and like that, right? That's also a big part of the community. And of course, also kosher slaughter, right? That's another thing. So we don't think about that too much in this part of the country where I live, but there's Jews who moved to Iowa who set up communities to be the kosher slaughtering communities, and a lot of our meat comes from them. And there's also groups in upstate New York, because we can't just use the normal kind of food systems. So a lot of this is shaped in the affordances, right? From a Reiki, right? The constraints and affordances here are very different. The world that I inhabit is very different because of this. It does shape where, when I talk to my wife, where are we going to live? If you're not living in Israel, it really, really narrows it down to there's only X number of places you could live in any given country, even neighborhoods, right? Because it's not just the city, it's the neighborhood level that you have to look at. So that rule about living in these dense things, really started in the second temple era. That the Qumran community had a different version of it, but the versions of that rule, and part of it's also polemical, because people who took the Bible very literally, sects like the Karaites or the Sadducees, understood that you weren't allowed to leave your house during the Sabbath. Whereas for us, like, no, part of the Sabbath was being with your community. It was not being by yourself with your family in your house. So like that kind of drove, like, we needed a way to form community. We worked within the rules of like what symbolically that was understood as. So like, for instance,
So the rule of like getting to synagogue like within walking distance, that's from like the destruction of the second temple.
um, some way and version and form of that, basically, because
Okay.
you basically, this idea of Eruv. Eruv is a symbolic binding of a physical space with objects. They're usually kind of like poles and string that marks out like a space. It's literally like it goes through the trees, it goes through backyards, like, and it's around my entire neighborhood. Within that space, I'm allowed to carry on the Sabbath. Without that, I couldn't carry outside of my house. If I couldn't carry, I can't bring kids to synagogue, right? So like that, like they all tie together. In an era, maybe where you're not bringing kids to synagogue and just the men are going, and or one representative of the family, then maybe you don't need to carry and you can leave everything at the synagogue and whatever. But if you're really going to have synagogues that are family friendly, then yeah, you have to live within that string. On top of that, you're also not allowed to walk more than about like a mile and a third outside of that space. That's based on the size of the camp in the desert. So like 2,000 amot is like this 2,000 cubits to any direction.
Yeah,
It's kind of the limit of how far you can walk beyond that. So yeah, so it really does limit like how far you're going. And yeah, we can say it's very legalistic and technical, and it is like it is. But like we have these rules, and these rules created. They're the surfaces against we have friction against that give us the ability to move, right? Like these are the affordances and the constraints that allow us to create the spaces. The philanthropy thing for the parents, if you look at 17th century Poland, the potato, I think, is just introduced. Populations are beginning to kind of kick back after the war with Sweden and whatever. But the Jewish population is growing way faster than the non-Jewish, than the Christian population, the Catholic population, and people are kind of curious, like why. So, like if you look at the data, though, it seems that it's because newly married couples lived with the in-laws for the first like couple years of marriage, and that way, like they weren't on their own, and they had immediate family support. And even when they moved out, it was assumed that their parents were going to be helping support them until they really got on their feet and got jobs.
And they would probably live within walking distance, as you said.
They'd always be within walking distance. But that was true of anyone who lived in small town Poland in the 17th century. The difference between the Catholics and the Jews, though, was around the philanthropy systems, especially around how you support newly married or people who are about to get married, newly married couples, and couples who just had kids. Like those three areas are like these really key sections where and look, the Catholics in Poland, the serfs had lots of problems. Like they were dealing with a lot of issues, and they did come up with solutions to other things. This was not an area, and they were still having population growth, but like it wasn't like they were totally failing and they were whatever. But it was not as fast, right? So this is not like meant as a critique of them. It's just like their different communities figured out and navigated these things in different ways. In part, like the reason this was navigated the way it was had to do with an education system around like what male education expectations were, and that still is true today.
That's really where those male educational standards set up. Was it from the destruction of the Second Temple
even before,
and the need for literacy?
So even before, if the rabbinic texts are accurate, and we can talk about how accurate they are at preserving this, but at least in our historical memory, some basic level of male education was put in place, probably like in the late Hasmonean period. So this is before the Romans, even maybe, or right at the beginning, but before Herod for sure. And this is compulsory. Male children over the age of 5 were expected to have some basic level of education. Now, whether that was successful or not is another question. And we could say, actually, Rabbinic Judaism, in some ways, the rabbis were the success stories from this, and they actually doubled down on education way more, even after the destruction of the temple. But they already have the seeds of that earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's interesting because they are modeling themselves off the Greek academies, philosophical
Mm-hmm.
academies. To some degree, like the rabbinic circles around, let's say, Rabbi Akiva is not that different than the circle around Plato, or
Mm-hmm.
or what they understand that to be, the Stoic, circles. There's definitely like a lot of playing with the pedagogy systems that they're encountering, as well as developing their own. It does seem that, like, for the Bar Kokhba revolt, we have things where people sign their names if they're going to like join Bar Kokhba and fight against the Romans. And there's like some interesting analysis of like how many people actually knew how to sign their name, what language did they use.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
There's that data is probably biased because that revolt, people purposefully signed in Hebrew sometimes because like it was
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
Hebrew national pride kind of as part of it. But it actually seems that like Aramaic still is more than Hebrew, but like a good percent, I think it's like 20 or 30% of these randomly selected men to some degree, like actually could sign their name in Hebrew. I think it's about an equal number in Aramaic, and then maybe like 10% do it in Greek, if I remember. And then there's like 30% who like just write an X, they can't sign their name, something like that.
Yeah.
So, but like,
Okay.
but some level of this is super old. But I think it's really complicated because I could say like, is it education? Yes, but at the same time, like it's a very specific like, what are the expectations for different ages of education, and the gender really mattered, like in the European situation, in the
And
modern
it probably
situation.
wouldn't work without the idea that the parents live with the husband goes and lives with the in-laws for a while. How old does that idea go? 'Cause, I mean, it's funny because I think of Moses and even Jacob, but like let's
Well,
see.
so there's the Genesis thing of a man goes to his wife, right, to join.
Yeah.
Like, so it's Genesis. Now, there were periods in Jewish history that were the opposite. There were periods where the women went to the house of the man. I should say periods and locations, right? So not periods. So like there were times when that was reversed and you went to the man's family and not to the
Mhm.
woman's. But, and that's especially true for priests. So because women who marry into the priesthood are moving into the priest's house very
Mhm.
specifically. So you do have kind of both models, but you're still moving to one family or the other. I mean,
Yeah.
you're
Okay. Okay. Okay.
not always living with them, but there's an expected deep relationship where you're seeing them often. We know, for instance, from the Mishnah, so this is probably a second century practice, maybe first, that women in the first year of marriage would still expect to spend holidays with their family. And they might leave their husband to do that. They may not go together as a couple, but in that first year, they might actually go separately like just the same way that we split up Thanksgiving and Christmas or whatever, like
Yeah.
between couples. So they were thinking about these things then, and kind of already have ideas about this and like what the expectations are. And they were navigating all this and like a long time ago, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know which constraint will matter 100 years
Mhm.
or 1,000 years down the line, right? I don't think the people who worked on, hey, this binds us together, like this ritual with this string binds us together so we can carry to each other's houses and bring food to each other's houses in the first century. I don't think they were thinking necessarily that I don't think they could have predicted what we've done with that. It just so
Mhm.
happened that it worked really well, and in fact, like as the rabbis, so urbanization happens for Jews sometime in the 7th or 8th century, actually even before Christians kind of make it amplify it. Even in Babylonia, where Jews were allowed to own land, you
Yeah.
see Jews beginning to urbanize, especially
Voluntarily
voluntarily, especially with the building of Baghdad. Um, to some degree,
for
voluntarily.
learning.
Um, so part of it's for learning. For a long time, the way that learning worked is that there were these big academies, like there are major academies in Babylonia. There was one in modern day Tunisia. There was a couple in the land of Israel, and obviously, if you lived somewhere else, like you didn't go to those usually, unless you were a prodigy. But if you lived in those regions, you would go to those academies, and then if you were married, you could not spend all your time there because we don't have monks, right? We don't have celibacy. Like we're expected to go home a certain
Yeah.
amount, a certain frequency. There are actually rules about this because because when you get married, one of the rights of the wife in the marriage contract is for sexual intimacy,
Yeah, yeah.
which is a huge difference. And because of that, like that means that what is she entitled to? What is her right? Like, and that depends actually on the man's profession, and there's like a whole bunch of other stuff where that it's not just like a flat rule, but she does have a right, and that's based on the expectations of what his profession is or what his planned profession is when she marries him. So yeah, so you have to go back, but yeah, they would go to the academy usually like in the agricultural seasons, like when they were farmers. They worked around the agricultural calendar more. There were some people who spent full time in the academy and then came home. Those were like the teachers or like the primary students, but then there was also like general public could attend those academies during the off months of the agricultural year for like 2 months in the middle of the summer, basically.
So why did urbanization happen?
Urbanization, so it's a good question. I don't know if we have a full answer. I think part of it has to do with the Muslim conquest and how the organization of the Sasanian Empire switches under the Muslims into the caliphate, especially with the building of Baghdad, where they want to centralize control and power over all the minority communities, and they bring the Babylonian Jewish academies that are in other cities get relocated there. The Nestorian libraries and monasteries get relocated to Baghdad. The Buddhist astronomy university that's way on the other side of the empire in like northern India, Pakistan, gets relocated to Baghdad. Like they're really trying. This makes Baghdad a fascinating and amazing place, like to talk about. And like from when it's built in like 750 or so, at least for the first 250 years, it is like a fascinating place where all these people and ideas and things are flourishing and interacting and sometimes fighting. But I think that really drives urbanization because it has to do with control of the new political leadership wants to impose control. And the best way to do that is through an urbanization. The Talmud is already finished by then. Like the Talmud has already been written. So when the Talmud is finished being written, it is at the end of the agricultural period. It doesn't necessarily close it closes not because of the Muslims, it closes because of internal Sasanian instability, but then the Muslims take advantage of that and conquer. So it almost immediately after the close of the Talmud, the rabbis for the next 8-10 generations are then trying to take that and adapt it and use it in an urban context, but they already have this is already all the conversations have already happened, basically. So we're going to take the Talmud, take the conclusions as we understand it, take those conversations and figure out how they now apply. We have a lot of this stuff has not survived. A lot of this stuff was deliberately destroyed by Christians and Muslims, but also a lot of it just doesn't survive time. We have some material from this period. It's nowhere near. I think estimates are we have 1/10 of the material that was actually written. So we don't know as much as we would like to. At the same time, people were also starting Jewish communities in Western Europe, in France and in Italy. Oh, Italy already had, but France and in Spain, in England, and they were in communication. They were sending letters to these academies that are on the other side of the world, basically. I mean, certainly from their perspective, trying to how do we do this here? Now we're super far away from you, and we can't ask you guys everything all the time. We don't live in the same street as you anymore. How do we do this here? So they do try to start working on how you make this work, and part of that is law codes. Part of that is standardizing the prayer book. So you're not going to rely on the oral tradition alone, but we're actually going to start writing a lot more down, and that helps because Baghdad is where all the paper is made. It is the center of paper production in the West. And it is actually, in fact, chosen in part because it is perfect for making paper. So they're able to disseminate a lot of this information with this new technology in a new way. The Chinese had it, but the Muslims get it after a battle in the 730s. And then it becomes this huge industry in Baghdad. And now that's why Baghdad is famous. That's why they have libraries. That's why they're actually sending knowledge to the rest of the world, including the discovery of the Greeks by the Muslims initially, which is happening in Baghdad. And then it also happens a little bit later in Spain. But a lot of that's being facilitated because paper making is suddenly possible, and it's so much cheaper and easier to maintain libraries of paper than it is of scrolls or papyrus. It's way more durable, and when you erase it, you can tell. Like erasing leaves a mark on the paper, which is, it just makes it way more useful as a official document process. So yeah, so like, but how would you like? I'm doing this analysis at a lower level than you want to, I think, like, 'cause I know that, like, I'm getting into details, but the details matter so much to the way this history played out. And I think we're going to face similar problems because, like, we're going to, you're thinking about, okay, what are the things, the frame I need to get to, like, the things that shape, or like the way urbanism or success in urban environments work for modern religious people. And like, I could distill some of the Jewish ones. So many of them are like not going to necessarily be relevant. Some of them will be, but parts of them are like shaped by like super gritty resolution of the historical like shaping of how this ended up getting to where it is. And on top of that, like AI is the paper making, right? Like AI is like going to give us the wrench in the works, and like, and the power and like the downsides of like these other psychotechnologies. And it's really hard to see how that's going to work. And I actually don't know that the Jewish Orthodox community is situated well for AI, because generally like half of that community just, doesn't even want TVs in their house, isn't using smartphones, is using things for business in a very limited way. There's this other part of the Orthodox community that does use technology, like uses it, but like is pretty careful with it, and like doesn't have a more wisdom than anyone else does on AI at this moment. It is interesting. I have a friend who like does like kind of Jewish theology and like things with AI, who's like, he's been very carefully tracking the Catholics and the Mormons and other like religious groups, Muslims, on like how they're approaching this. There's obviously no solution, but they also don't know like what's the 10-year or 15 or 50-year down the line impact of this thing. In some ways, like, the guys who learn all day and want to stay in yeshiva all day and learn, AI might be great for them. AI might be, hey, humans don't have to work anymore, and you can go do the thing that like makes you feel the most fulfilled and connects you to God, and and you have your family and you're learning, and that might be it. It could also enable lots of people to, in the Christian world, to be basically like monks or nuns, right? And like kind of do that monastic kind of turn where like they don't have to do this other work, and they can like, concentrate on their prayer life and hesychasm or whatever, wherever they're coming out of. On the other hand, it could like totally uproot and destroy like everything, right? Like we also understand like there's a lot of real and imminent dangers of connection and technology that it could present. And like, I don't know that what we have, I don't know that what Judaism has prepared us better for AI, or whether it prepared us better for the internet than other parts of the world, beyond just like very strict siloing and saying we don't use this either in these houses or with these ages or in this day of the week.
I think it's super useful to think in terms of analogies, and one thing I'd be curious to know is how well these communities have handled social media, because we know one of the things that's destroying Western families and relationships is social media. It's fracturing men and women apart very significantly. It's causing all kinds of mental issues in the young. That's like making them less likely to form relationships and families and so on. So like the fertility crisis, the faith crisis, the social media crisis, the technology crisis in general, it's all related. And the technology crisis is fairly recent. We have good data like on, let's say, the West as a whole, but I'm not aware of data on Jewish communities and how they have handled it better or worse.
So certainly the Haredi communities are doing great because their kids aren't on social media. In fact, neither are most of their adults. In those worlds, the only acceptable form of kind of platform communication is WhatsApp, which is not social media and allows for, in some ways, a lot more control. We can talk about it has downsides too. It's not the ideal platform. But WhatsApp is the app. Like in Israel, like you have to be on WhatsApp to like be part of anything social. You won't know about any events, way more than anything else. You don't see a lot, and part of why you probably also don't see things is there are very few like Orthodox the percentage of Orthodox rabbis on YouTube or something, or on social media, tends to be very small compared to the total number, because like it isn't. It's looked on with a lot of suspicion, and the people who are on it, like one should always like kind of check with someone else and take with a grain of salt until they've been kind of verified, because there's a lot of, it's often people who are from the fringe of those communities who are ending up on social media. Now there are places, there's like, I think there's different levels of this. So like mono-Orthodox Jews, you will find much more on social media. Jonathan Haidt's book, though, got like a ton of attention on the anxious, the one about, the anxious generation, the one on cell phone use. Like they actually literally gave that out in my daughter's school for free to the parents. They wanted all of us to read it, and they made like a school pledge about like kids aren't allowed to have cell phones till they're, I can't remember what grade or age, but it's either 14 or 16 or something. That doesn't mean kids aren't using tablets at home necessarily, but like it does put some restriction. It's voluntary. You don't have to do it, but like I think 70 or 80% of the parents signed it. They got pretty good. I don't think it's having I think it's being used very differently in our world to some degree. There's definitely been a rise in mental health issues in the Jewish world, or awareness of mental health issues. Is it rise or awareness? And like, I don't know that it's as social media generated. And it's still, I don't think it's at the same levels as the general secular world. But I don't have tons of data on that. I do know that there's a lot of really good books that have come out recently kind of on Judaism and mental health, or Orthodox Judaism and mental health, because there is certainly something being recognized there of like, there are unique challenges for that. But like, I don't know if there's been a huge increase. Marriage, so this is something else. So like we have, there's something we call the shidduch is like matchmaking crisis. But for us, the crisis is that only 80% of mono-Orthodox Jewish men and women are married by the time they're 25, and 90% by the time they're 40. And for Haredim, I think it's 90% by the time they're 25 and 98% by the time they're 40. But that's the crisis. The crisis is that's not 100%. The crisis for us is not, and like it's an order of magnitude difference from general society. And we care about it a lot. Like we're putting a huge amount of resources into fixing that gap. And it's mostly a gap in like people getting married later than they wanted. It's not that they're not getting married, it's just that they want to get married earlier, and that's not happening, and trying to understand why that is and how to like mitigate that. So like that concerns us a lot, but we're like, there's no, I don't know what the parallel is. I don't know what the parallel for Christian communities would be, but like, and maybe there are ones in some.
And I think it's just way weaker. I think,
but we take this super seriously. That like that's 80% and not 100% or 90%. Something like that. Like everyone who wants to get married should get married. I think the other part of this, and we've been going a long time, so maybe we'll wrap up soon. But I know we talk about a lot. The other part of this I do want to talk about, I think is useful, is there's a tendency in religious circles, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, whatever. I mean, I think it's pretty universal, where the people who are like doing the strictest thing become sort of like aspirational. So in Christian communities, I think this is often, especially in the Catholic and Orthodox communities, I think this is often monastics. So like they're like doing something that's like special and is particularly holy, and something that like not everyone can do, not everyone's called to do, but like there's an aspiration to be, or it might be other holy orders. It might be priests or bishops, but
for Catholic it's probably more priests and bishops.
Okay, right. And then for the Eastern Orthodox, it's monastics. But there is this where it's like they keep these rules the most strictly, and that kind of becomes the anchor and model and aspiration. For Jews, the people who keep the things the most strictly are the Haredim, which are broadly both,
and they are aspirational.
And to some degree, the modern Orthodox community does aspire to be more like them. Now, but that's a huge difference, because if my aspiration is, oh man, I wish I could have had 3 or 4 more kids, and like it sucks that I only had 4 and not 8, versus like the 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 priest or the monk being the goal, which are celibate. Like you got it's a very different like push, and it's a very different pressure, right? Like toward a different direction. Now, I don't necessarily like the fact that people aspire to be charedim. I actually think like the modern Orthodoxy has a better balance to some degree. There's things I admire about their community, but there are reasons why I'm not part of that community. At the same time, like, but like I do think when your society aspirationally kind of is pushed in one direction or another, that really does orient you in a different way. And I think like some Protestant groups, which are much more focused on like having lots of kids and family, like these are small groups. And I'm not just talking about the Amish here, though. I mean, we can go not just the Anabaptists, even though I know Mennonites and Hutterites and things, like we can expand that. But I think there are other Protestant groups in the evangelical world who are very traditional, who like have very traditional family values and also really value having a lot of kids, right? That does exist in other circles. Of course, also for Mormons. It's the other kind of obvious group here. That does exist. But I don't see, like I don't know how that will work for the Catholic and Orthodox, because they don't have that pressure or that aspiration, that kind of driving that. Like what, like I don't know what they could replace it with. I don't know, like, or what alternative kind of model.
I mean, I can tell you what it was recently, like, because I mean, not that far back, what happened, let's say in my grandparents' time, was you had 2 tracks. Like the best thing would be to be a celibate, like a priest or a nun or something, but then otherwise, like max out kids. So like we go just a few generations back, and like it's like 12 kids is pretty normal in Quebec. And it was like competitive. So my mother has stories from her grandma, like bragging when she's talking with like other women of her generation that she has more kids and that kind of thing. So that thing used to be.
Yeah, it's possible.
The thing, and that's why I'm curious about the continuum. And I mentioned the idea of like studying social media, because I see the problem of, and I think you agree, like initially we didn't totally like own in on this part, but I see like a relationship between technology and the city, and the fact that, let's say, Jews have urbanized a long time ago, and have like developed strategies to thrive in urban environments, prepared them to do stuff like handle social media better than like Westerners in general, who used to be more rural for a longer time. And we have newer technologies. For AI, I would bet it's going to be a continuity thing again. Like I would think that communities who are better able to handle life in cities and social media and like technology in general are going to do better with AI.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. I also think we're sort of in between in a place, because like this is kind of golden mean Aristotelian thought, but like part of like the issue, let's say with Catholics and like the competition and why that's gone, right, is like contraception, and then of course kind of the debate, or the very short debate over whether the pill was a problem or not, from Catholic, because it's developed by a Catholic, and he thought like it was a solution because it was in between, and then it was rejected by the church, whereas for Jews, I don't know that we handled this better, but like we have rules about contraception. They are more strict than general society. They're not as strict as Catholics. We have rules about abortion that are similar. I mean, it is, both of them are allowed, but in an extremis, and like in very controlled circumstances, with advice of a rabbi, like not advice, sorry, with a ruling. You have to actually have like a binding of heaven and earth, right? So they have to actually give like a ruling on like how, and like these things, and like, so it's very controlled, very heavily regulated, but it's not like you either do or you don't. It's like we live in that tension, that continuum, and it's sort of like the Eastern Orthodox to some degree, where like I know they go to their priests for like lots of things, right? And everything is tailored to the individual. So like we go to our rabbis, maybe not for quite as much as the Eastern Orthodox, but we go to them for a lot to like at least have discussions, if not to get actual rulings. on like, hey, for me, in my situation, given my context, that could be whatever. I mean, there's lots of factors, and they're the ones deepest participating in the tradition who spent those years kind of in it, learning it, understanding all the sources, the wisdom, and then like how to actually apply it, living as a source to your daily life, right? And that, like, right, so it's not just that there's this education and this focus, but also creating a group of people, a trusted, and this is a part of it, like the trust crisis is part of this, right? Like an authority of trust who hopefully, and this is always a problem, like our rabbis actually staying up to date on current technologies, whether they're medical breakthroughs or food or housing or whatever it is, but like, and that puts a lot of pressure on them, and sometimes that means specialization, right? We can talk about that too as part of urbanization, but like, but you do need authorities, specific and trusted authorities, both in the tradition and in kind of the modern world, on specific issues that you can go to and get clarity from, and that's who sort of take, even if they're wrong, like they take some responsibility off of you. It's not you doing it by yourself. You have, and not, or you and your spouse doing it by yourselves. But you have people that you trust that you can go to. And of course, like, it's not that they're fully immune from all the other outside pressures and social media and influence and all these other things either. They're living in the same world. They're also married, right? But like, they're there as like, you know, as pastoral support and help. But also like to really sell it, you know, to really personalize it for you. And you need enough people, right? So this is, I know, a big problem for all of us. I mean, not as much for Orthodox Jews, but for the other denominations of Judaism and for Catholics and Orthodox, the clergy pipeline shortages are a huge, huge issue. Because like, if you can't support the infrastructure, that means, or you don't trust the institutions to form that infrastructure, then you don't have that extra level of support. And then how do you, like, what do you, then you go to the internet, then you need to find your internet pastor or whatever, or your icon carver or your professor, right? And
I think in Catholicism we're lucky because there are enough Catholics in the world that we can get lots of priests from outside. It's pretty common. I think that the challenges for us, at least, is really more like building communities. And the difficult thing, and it's something I think we should wrap up soon because it's like over 2 hours. But one last point that I find different, and I don't know if we can get much more clarity on it today, but like, there's such a big spectrum within, if you say Catholic or Orthodox or even different denominations of Protestants, there's like a huge spectrum between those groups in people who are more, let's say, conservative and have stronger families and who have lots of kids, and the people who are much more laxed and like behaviorally indistinguishable from the normal Westerner and who have like almost no kids. I find it, I wonder why, like, I cannot find, I don't think I can find, I mean, I know like a few small groups maybe, but like they're so small that it's not that good to talk about widely, but there are very few groups I can identify who are as numerous, let's say, as Neo-Orthodox Jews or the Haredim, who like have managed to deal with technology in a way that doesn't destroy their communities and fertility rates. Yeah. So that's because I get your point earlier about like survivorship bias and like you have this like these branches that establish and you can like pinpoint one branch now that seems to be doing well, but I'm not even sure that I can like make out clear branches within, let's say, Catholicism or one thing we can say is actually the people who go to church every week, they have fertility rates above replacement. That we know. But like if you take like all of Catholics, those who like go to church every week, we don't have a good word for them. Maybe you'd say like good Catholics, I guess. But it's like we don't have clear words the same way that you do.
Right. Well, so but here, and we have different terms. So like we have Jews include all Jews, including Jews who practice nothing and have no Jewish education. Right. Like it's not a useful category. We use the term affiliated Jews for Jews that at least like belong or are members of a synagogue, or go to one even if it's once a year, like that's at least something. That's better than nothing. It's about half. It's about 50% of Jews in America are affiliated. And then like ones that I consider in the Orthodox orbit, like those four groups we just said earlier, are like in the U.S. are like 10 to 15% of the population. But like what you're describing of this broad range, that's the traditional Jews, the Jews that like may or may not call themselves Orthodox, but like do like keep stuff and like are in these kind of geographically defined communities more than denominationally defined. They have this they have the same range. One of the things that kind of Westernization did to Judaism was introduce kind of the idea of denominations and terms that broke up that traditional spectrum and said, okay, this end of the spectrum, we're going to call Orthodox. The people who are actually like trying to keep these laws the best they can, and you know, within the framework of you know these books or these propositions or these whatever axioms, we're going to call that Orthodox. And people who aren't in that realm, you know, who are actually part of a formal denomination, you know, Reform, Conservative, whatever, they're parts of the formal denominations. So I think part of this is just like the way we absorb modernity is like we needed a word for the people. We needed words for these people who are continuing doing stuff. But Orthodox itself isn't a denomination. It's really just like a subset of, and more formalized subset of, let's say, the traditional spectrum. Does having a word help? Maybe. I think it certainly helps for like collecting demographic data, and like pointing to something and saying, hey, like those guys seem to be different. How do we differentiate them? And there's more than just like, it's not just church attendance, right? Like, or synagogue attendance in this case, right? Like it's a whole package. Like those people have a whole package that does really differentiate them in a meaningful way. I'll say, I wanted to add, because I know we're wrapping up here, to your point, Israel is a weird case of all this, but in some ways it's a good test. It's a good way to look through this frame, because in Israel, you have Haredim who do not use technology very much, or they have like a cell phone or a laptop for business, or they use an internet cafe. Internet cafes are still pretty big there to some degree compared to the US at least, because you don't have the computer in your home that way. It's in a controlled public environment, so you're not going to go do anything like stupid on it. There might be kosher internet cafes where like there's filters and blocks, you know, for certain websites, so like, you know, whatever. But there's some participation in technology, but like not very much. Like in the Haredi world, it's really just for business. Maybe sometimes they'll use older technology for spreading teaching. So they might use cassette tapes or CDs or like controllable older media to like do that sometimes. But the people in the middle, in Israel, it's the religious Zionists, are not afraid of technology. Many of them are like very pro technology. We can use this we use it to transform the desert to make it bloom. We use it to like bring back modern Israel and to make it a high tech hub. Like they're very much of this startup nation, whatever mindset. But they aspire to be the Haredim. So even so they still are going to have a lot of kids. And what's really nice about all that is because the Haredim are a big enough part of the population, the social structure of the entire country is built around expecting people to have kids. There's playgrounds everywhere. There's tons of daycares. There's tons of social support, and like the country is structured at all the levels, at the national level, at this regional level, at the city, neighborhood, whatever levels. We're going to assume a good portion of our population has kids or is going to be having kids, and whether that's going to be 12 kids for the Haredim or just 5 or 6 kids for the modern Orthodox or the religious Zionists, like that helps kind of allow that balance to happen. And at the same time, the secular Jews who are like totally not affiliated, don't want to do anything with that stuff, atheists, you know, whatever, they're still living in a place that has infrastructure for having kids. So they will have more kids, both because aspirationally they might see like everyone around them has kids and like that's the norm. Even if they're not religious, you know, they may be like, okay, maybe it's okay to have more kids. I don't have that. But also like the health system and the school system, whatever, is set up for me. And the walkability of the towns are set up for me to have more kids. It only helps a little bit, right? Like the secular Jews in Israel, I think their TFR is like 2.5 or 2.3. So it's not like a huge like way over other places, but it is over replacement, and it probably is like a 0.5 boost or something, right? So it is something. It shouldn't be ignored. but the people who are actually doing the balancing with technology, and look, part of the reason I reached out to you, we haven't talked about this. It's been 2.5 hours, but like we haven't. I part reached out because at the end of your article, you said you wanted. It sounded like you wanted more engagement from actual Jews.
Yeah.
Also, I saw the comments. Now, I'm not a member of Symbolic World. I couldn't read those comments, but I saw the comments when Pedro shared it on YouTube. I saw the comments on his really recent stream about Jews and Muslims being anti-Christ, and like I know the Grail Country audience is probably going to be much more sympathetic and not whatever, but like there was a lot of really disturbing whatever comments and around Jews and Israel, whatever, and like I understand there's like a lot of needles to thread here, in different ways, but the community and like that maybe gets the props for where they're due to some degree most. It should be the religious Zionists. We can have all sorts of disagreements with their philosophy and politics and all of that stuff, but they're the ones who are actually doing the balance of the technology and having bigger families way more than the other Orthodox groups to the right of them or the non-Orthodox Jews to the left of them. And we actually have someone in this little corner who lives in Israel of that community, Chazi, who like was super excited by your article, and he follows Symbolic World much more closely than I do. I think he was the one who sent it to me. But yeah, like there is probably a lot more to be said here about that community, and I'm not familiar with the American side of this community, which is modern Orthodox and a little bit different. And I will say, like we're still navigating this a lot. And right now, our challenge actually has to do with the gambling apps much more. If I'm going to call out something, and I only know this anecdotally, but I've heard that especially high school boys and young professional men, the gambling apps have become an issue, in a way that like I haven't heard it called out in other places. And part of it's the very fact is we are calling it out.
First time I hear like anything about that, like from any community.
So this might be an American thing more than Canada, but like in America over the past 30 years, gambling laws have been restructured and loosened a lot in all sorts of ways. And now we have polymarket and Kalshi, right? So it's not just sports gambling. And the modern Orthodox community here, their big sport is basketball. And but the gambling, and gambling is like a huge no. Like it's not like the level of like eating a ham sandwich or something, but it like disqualifies you from giving testimony in a court case, like in their Jewish law. Like it's a serious, it's a serious thing. And like so on the one hand, I don't love that it's happening. I think like it hit us like a brick wall in ways that we did not expect because like we have handled other problems better. At the same time, I am hardened by the fact that like we're noticing it and calling it out and actually like working on it actively and it's not, and fairly quickly, right? Like within less than a year of like the first articles about, hey, this is a problem we need to be addressing, like people are already like actively working on solutions for it. So I do think like that awareness, like jumping in, like we're going to solve this problem. It's a community-wide problem. We need to like this has been true like across a lot of these examples. That requires a mindset of like participation in community that like, you want to talk about like a big upstream thing, like the expectation that like, you have something that everyone has something to contribute. And like that, that every role matters and like there's, and you're always called to give, but like give in these ways, right? I'm not saying, and your expertise matters. Yeah. So like this is, so we're still navigating this too. But I think, being able to define what your community is and being able to like actually not just identify the problems. Everyone finds problems. It's easy to find problems.
Other communities it can be way longer. Many people in the West haven't identified the root of the problem at all. So like the first step's identifying the problems, but then like, and the second step's not having the solutions. You don't have the solutions. No one has the solutions to like any of this stuff, like off the bat, top down. But like,
being the person who's willing to test the new solutions and like getting in there, getting dirty, figuring it out. So it's true for genetic testing too, right? So we have this specific problem of endogamy. So Jews marry other Jews for the most part. We have all these genetic diseases, and like we were really early, like early 1980s was like the first, and like we pioneered it in some ways. Like the Tay-Sachs testing was really the first kind of like marriage testing that you gave to couples who wanted to get married. And like we have like a whole set of wisdom around this because we have multiple companies that tried this, multiple groups, philanthropies, and some of them work better than others. Some of them, still like have pros and cons, and like we're still kind of working through how to use these technologies. And part of that is the benefit of like super decentralized kind of processing, right? And it's sort of a Vervaeke point, right? And I don't know if this is different for Catholics, because as to your point, Catholics are a huge broad range, but at the same time there is a central point, and like you have now an AI encyclical, and to some degree like that will be interpreted in different ways, but like all Catholics do need to pay attention to that encyclical, is my understanding, to some degree. Whereas for us, like there's no one rabbi do that. That's the power of the Sanhedrin. We don't have that now. When the Messiah comes, maybe we'll have it. Like we have to deal with this as a decentralized way, which is somewhat more akin to the Eastern Orthodox. But like this means that like each community, or like really local community, and to some degree maybe regional, is going to like try different solutions to this, and then whatever kind of solutions work will get adopted, kind of diffusely, or recombined. Diffusely. So that's a different discussion. We should end.
But like, I think that's a good place. It was super interesting. I feel like I would have questions for hours more, but after a while we get tired.
It's good. And I have to get my kids from school soon. But I mean, thinking about how the incentive structures, I say. I mean, to me, like that's a lot of what this is like incentive structures and where those affordances and pressures and frictions are. And a lot of it's luck of what you're going to inherit in the container, but like how much of it can you cultivate, and how long are you willing to do that, right? Like a lot of these projects, in some sense, like they weren't thinking about the next 100 years. They were thinking, they're sort of like cathedrals, right? But these are cathedrals of not physical cathedrals. Like how do you do if the tabernacle building is 6 days a week? That's your building your physical cathedral. How do you do that one day a week of building the social cathedral? Like that's a challenge.
All right.
That was great. So I felt like
I'd be happy to talk again with you. Zevi, you said, but I think maybe a few months to think about stuff.
Zevi is someone else who's interesting. He's the one who talks to Vervaeke sometimes.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever caught any of his stuff.
So
Zevi comes out of the Chabad Hasidic world, and he has a different perspective on all of this. He's fascinating though. He's great. I love Zevi.
But I should go. But let's keep in touch, and there's lots of stuff I want to still keep thinking about and work on. But I'll probably send an email or something in a few months.
That's fine. Hopefully I got enough of your questions, and I felt like I talked a lot. So, but hopefully you built a better picture, a more defined picture of what's going on.
I had plenty of stuff I had not heard before, so that was helpful.
Yeah. Okay, right. Everybody, thanks for joining us. I guess there was an audience here, or there will be. Hopefully, I don't know if whoever stuck it out to the end. And if we have another conversation, we will see you back here.
Thanks.